Taylor, your professor for HISD 140, and this is the overview for this week's lesson in the module, which is the South expands, 1800 to 1860, the expansion of the South across the continent, actually. And you're going to see, we'll talk about today, the South changes prior to the Civil War, and talk about how it becomes this sort of powerful regional entity that helps building up to the Civil War and everything. But how it changes along with the North. We talked about industrialization a little bit already. A couple of things before I get started. One, I want to thank everyone for leaving feedback in the feedback forum for this week. I do appreciate it. It is helpful. I'll send an email out later today to both classes, let you know some of you have asked for a few things. So I respond with the email. One thing I do want to announce here, and I'll announce in the email, so maybe you want to know what your grades are right now. So I'm going to have by the end of the week, hopefully a 3/4 grade, because we're at the 12th week basically. So I'll have your total grade by the end of the week posted next to your midterm grade in the grade book for you. So you'll have that by the end of the week. And so today, talk about the slave-holding Republic of the South, because it is this, it's different, and it's kind of hard to judge the pre-Civil War South with any sort of detachment, knowing as we do how things turned out, knowing how people generally now recognize slavery as the great evil in American history that Americans committed. But we have to try to view it historically here. And so one of the things I talk about in the overview, and you'll get in the textbook, is a view of the South changing, as I mentioned earlier, as cotton becomes the predominant crop that it produces. It will lead to a couple of different things. One, of course, it expands west. It'll also lead to the expansion and to the increased importance of the internal slave trade. Remember, the international slave trade is abolished by the Constitution. Early in the 19th century, they have to stop importing slaves. That means internal slave trade is crucial for the expansion of slavery, basically, across the country. And so this leads to growing regional differences within the South. Because in the old quote-unquote old South, the Chesapeake area, Virginia, the Carolinas, the old colonial, if you want to put it that way, southern states, that's where you have in your mind images from popular culture of, ladies dressed in white and, gentlemen clad in, fine, whatever. That sort of refined view, which the South had of themselves, comes largely from those older areas where they had a lot of luxury, a lot of comfort, where there were well-established families. In the Deep South, and by the Deep South, Lower South, that's the Lower South, actually. Anyway, Deep South, we're talking as it moves to places like Alabama, to Mississippi, it's already in Louisiana, to Texas. It'll change its character. It'll become much less. The slave owners who move out there aren't interested in culture. They're interested in money. And even though they're wealthy, they're very wealthy, they don't have the same sorts of huge mansions, the same sorts of, if you like, pretensions about what slavery is. They just want money. And so there's a slightly different, they're less refined in a lot of ways than the people back in the Tidewater areas of the South. But there are also growing class differences in the South. You will have a fairly large, we'll come to this in a moment, but sometimes called small land holding or yeoman class of planters in the South, who are either, whites who have one or two slaves and are still kind of eking a living, or don't have any slaves. And there'll be tension between the slave owning class, which is never more than 10% of the population, white population of the South, and what is essentially the majority of white people, basically, in these states. So that's another issue. One other thing to mention about this before we get into this is that when we talk about slavery in the 19th century, it's something you should understand that historians used to view the South as an essentially pre-modern society, that it was, slavery was this archaic, barbaric holdover from the ancient world, which somehow managed to be, exist in the 19th century. And most scholars have corrected that view because, yes, slavery is an ancient institution, but the form of slavery they are practicing in the South is very modern in some ways. It's organized in ways that are much more, and they're beginning to organize themselves in ways that are much more, if you like, capitalistic. They're much more attuned to discipline and organization and things like this, as you would find in a modern economy. And in fact, of course, it's basically dependent on one crop by the time you get to the 1820s and 30s, cotton, which feeds a global economy. Means this is not a pre-modern thing, it's a modern thing. It's part of the reason why the South becomes so wealthy. It actually, as a whole, is wealthier than the North, even though, as you'll see, that wealth is very unevenly spread. Obviously, for a lot of reasons, and slaves, of course, don't see virtually any of it. But it's a sort of in some ways a paradox. The South, in many ways. That's the reason why the second part of his overview is that on the one hand, it has a rural agrarian, it's a cash crop society, seems backward, and yet it's filthy rich because it's part of a modern economy. It's a slaveholding republic. It's hard for us to remember because their ideas have been sort of, we excise them from our history because they're so ugly, but this was a Republican society. I don't mean Republican Party, but in the sense they believed in voting and all that stuff. The section in your textbook that talks about this is called the politics of democracy. These men they believed in republicanism. They believed in voting. They have to appeal to non-slaveholding whites down the social scale, who again weren't always necessarily fond of them. And so they had to make concessions to them in terms of granting voting rights to non-property holders and stuff like this. And so they have a Republican ideology which includes slavery. And in that sense, it's not modern, of course. But in every other way, they share the emphasis on liberty and rights with, of course, their northern, in many ways, increasingly non-slaveholding and anti-slavery opponents in the North eventually, although I wouldn't overdo it until it becomes a big issue in the 1840s and 50s for reasons we'll talk about next week. But it is very much a matter of this in the South. It is still a Republican society, and it's an alternative view of what the country should be like. Again, I ask you to understand this, not like it or admire it, but it is a viable alternative, and it's popular, by the way, outside the South. I'll come back to that in a moment. Other part you'll get from the textbook, should linger on a little bit, is the section on the creation of African American community in the early 19th century, because by the time you get to the early 19th century, you're finally beginning to have, something that we think of as a singular monolithic African American community has been created. And in particular, one of the things that's going to change, look created, is the embrace, finally, by the majority of blacks of Protestant Christianity. The Second Great Awakening is crucial for them because it helps them create black churches, black institutions that'll be central for giving it some stability through the slave period and on to Reconstruction afterward. But also a common culture based around, a common language. Finally, English is the common language they eventually remember. African Americans didn't all come from the same places, and so it's only by now you get this creation of a block of people who identify with each other. Which, again, if you're thinking one of the things that's eventually going to undermine slavery is that now they can all communicate with each other where they couldn't, 100 years before. One other thing to keep in mind about all this when you're going to read about slavery in the South. There's also a small free black population in the South, strange as it may sound. The free blacks in the South, when they get freed, they will fill certain roles there aren't enough people to fill, like being artisans and things like this in cities, usually commercial places. One of the biggest places, the biggest populations of free African Americans in the antebellum period is New Orleans, which of course was previously a Spanish colony. Had different, racial laws and everything. So that's another reason as well. But there is a tiny, I don't think it's more than a few 100,000, but they're there in the South. So interesting picture to take away from the text. And then finally, this is more me than the textbook, but I figure it would help you to understand this a little bit. And it'll talk about some of this in the textbook. Just what this Southern worldview, this Southern republicanism entails. It'll talk about the romanticized view of slavery that at least some of the people, again, not totally, again, it's different by region, the people in the Tidewater, in Virginia especially, Virginia is the heartland of the Old South. The idea of the plantation as this, harmonious, agreement, paternalistic agreement between master and slave. The master must take care of the slave, and stuff like this. And this is the big, justification for slavery as it begins to become under attack by Northern writers. And I should mention, by the way, that when we talk about the Southern worldview, there are, again, it gets written out of our history because they lost and because, well, they should have. But there was, and when I talk about something that makes great on the ears, there was an idea of republicanism that included slavery. Just like we know writers like James Fenimore Cooper and I'm forgetting the gentleman's name. Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It'll come back to me. You're saying it right now as you watch this. Washington Irving. But we have all these writers who are Northern who get sort of canonized. There were plenty of very popular Southern writers in the antebellum period. Names you don't need to know, by the way. I won't recite them here. Who were bestsellers, who not only wrote things like novels depicting plantation life in very idealistic terms, but also histories of the South. There was a concern, there was a sort of romanticism about, you saw romanticism playing out with, Ralph Waldo Emerson in the North in the last chapter. Well, this was the sort of counterpart to it in the South, mythologizing and sometimes being genuine histories. Some of them were well received in the period, but also, whitewashing the negative effects of slavery. And some of these, by the way, there was actually some very popular writers who sold, national bestsellers. Some of them women in the antebellum period in the South. One of the most popular of these was a woman named Caroline Lee Hentz, and she wrote a book called the Northern Planter's Bride, which we'll get to this next time. We'll get to the Civil War. Was a response to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which, again, to give you an idea of how people, we can't really take seriously the idea that slavery is good for the slaves, right? But one of the other ways that Southern writers, if you ask how you defend this stuff, right, understand that, they would deflect criticism by turning, criticism back on the North. You're criticizing for how we treat our slaves, but look how you treat your workers in factories up there. That's back to Caroline Lee Hentz in her book. That was one of the sort of arguments of the novel was, look, our economy to run needs a source of cheap labor. Hey, we have these slaves, we at least take care of them. You do nothing for those workers up in the North, which, again, is self-serving in the worst way. Also had a point. There were a lot of people criticizing that, even in the North, the way they treated the first generations of industrial workers. And so I don't tell you all this stuff, by the way, again, not meaning you to admire this or anything like that, but understand this was a viable living alternative to what the country eventually became. It was a live thing for these people. And you have writers like this all throughout the antebellum period, producing a pretty powerful view of society. I say powerful, why is that powerful? Slavery. Well, not just the slavery part, but you have to remember, and you won't get this till you get to the second part of American history, industrialization really kicks into high gear in the latter part of the 19th century and causes a lot of changes in the North and South, and the North mostly. And so this idea of a mythic, rural agrarian past when, relationships weren't based on money became very popular in the North. It's where you're going to get, I'll discuss Reconstruction in a couple of weeks. There was for a long time, academic historians writing about Reconstruction condemned it because it was part of this rapacious Northern industrialist capitalist, plot to destroy the good mythic South or whatever. And it has an influence. This is where you get, idealizations of the Old South and things like Gone with the Wind, if you've ever seen that movie or read that novel by Margaret Mitchell, 20th century author. This is a powerful idea. It's also a powerful idea, again, partly as a counter to, the problems of an industrial society. And just not only that, again, that Republican worldview, not to linger on it too much, but their republicanism was different in the North. Because remember, the North tended to emphasize the nation, the national state. These Republican slave owners emphasized the local community. That idea of localism is still kind of still a live undercurrent even today. The idea we should emphasize our local communities and give less power to the federal government, all that stuff. That it has an enduring effect. Again, the racism and slavery is basically gone, but that idea is still with us in some other regards. A couple other things I want to mention about the Southern worldview, which, as you can see, by the way, is deeply tied up with economics, which you're going to see this in the textbook, so I won't dwell on that too much here. It includes a couple of different things. This is something, by the way, it was mentioned, I believe, in the excerpt I gave you from Joyce Appleby's book, Inheriting the Revolution, even by the time you get to the early 1820s. Just the way they viewed themselves to the Southern planters. Their ideal ethic is one of honor, not necessarily the sort of charity-based ethic of the North, the sort of Puritan, you work hard, you thrifty. No, they believed in a sort of aristocratic ethos of honor, of defending your honor, of giving your largesse to your family and stuff like this. Very different, moral code in some ways than was cultivated in the North in the Republican ideal. And then lastly, of course, the other thing, just it's not a big differentiation because they're actually the same in a lot of ways. They have in common in the North is their religion. Again, they're caught up in the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, like the North is. And so they're divided by slavery is what it is. And so increasingly you will get, as slavery begins to expand, more and more religious justifications for slavery's existence. And it's, in their mind, it's necessity. Also, one other thing to note as well, again, we tend to, and this goes back to this, first of all, the South lost the war. Then, of course, yeah, they should have because slavery is evil. But, again, that obscures the fact that we're not talking about uneducated hillbillies here who are running the South. On the average, the North is much more better educated than the South. Not when you get to the elites. There were actually a higher percentage of Southern planters in the elite classes who went to university or college than did in the North. And so a lot of these guys they're very well educated. They're educated in a sort of classical mode as well. I'll give you one example, by the way, who to come back to the issue of literature, when we don't remember Southern writers anymore before the war. The one person we do read who's Southern, whose literature still makes it into modern canons of American literature, is Edgar Allan Poe, who went to UVA and had a really good classical education there. UVA, University of Virginia. And this was fairly common. These are not uneducated, they're not stupid, they're not any of this stuff. And yet they embrace it as part of their world, this morally corrupting system. So something to keep in mind about these slave owners when you think about what they're doing. And then finally, I come to the readings for this week. The readings, the primary readings, we're going to focus mostly, I mentioned, on those regional differences in the South. We're going to talk a lot about the yeoman class. There'll be several primary documents that talk about what life is like for those, non-slave holding whites. It's pretty rough themselves. And then several documents about slave life, especially as it moves into the Chesapeake, out of the Chesapeake into the Deep South, into the Gulf states, and it can be really brutal, and we'll talk about that. As well as the effect slavery has on, there's one, I think it's Mary Chestnut, her diary. She's a diarist in the South, in which, and this is during the war, and she actually confesses her hatred for slavery. So it has some of the ill effects that this has on people's intimate lives in the primary readings. This week, the secondary essay is by Anthony Payne, and it has to do with the creation of African-American ties through intimate relationships and struggle against their masters in this period. In some ways, again, it's kind of weird. Slavery creates the African-Americans as a single people in some ways. Horrible to think about, but that is kind of what it does. And it gives you a little glimpse into how that affects, the tragedies of personal life, but also in a way, I guess it's kind of heartening because they do persevere through this so well, and they do, there is some, there's some sort of element of stability on all this. In their lives, they build through these institutions which will emerge, especially after the war during Reconstruction. Will have the major institutions of African American life as they still exist even today, and things are changing along with everything else today. But the pattern begins to be set under slavery during the during the antebellum period. So this is again, this chapter is usually kind of an odd one in terms of, again, we're studying the South, and again, they're studying a slaveholding society. So, but think about it in those terms, but understanding, where the country is going. But also remember, one thing to keep in mind here is that the South is going through the same changes in some ways the North is. They're both expanding. They're both pushing west. Industrialization, in terms of the growth of that in the North. But the South is feeding those factories with its cotton. As much as the Northerners don't want to admit it, they're kind of part of the reason they do. I guess some of the more extreme figures do. And I say only extreme. The North only really turns against slavery in public opinion, really in a big way, in about a decade, the decade before the Civil War. Up to the 1850s, it's not a big of an issue. It's only, as you're going to see in the next couple of weeks, a real small minority who really, and historians go back and forth on this, they're the ones who really push it in a way that makes it this big issue in the 1850s, and other things sort of play into this. But it's part of a singular system. That, self-serving justification for slavery that those Southern writers before the war gave, like, hey, we need cheap labor to run our great economy and make ourselves wealthy. Better to do it through slavery than through, exploiting factory workers. Maybe awful, but it has a certain, that should sound familiar to you, because we're still having debates about things like, mass immigration. Why do we do that? I know Americans want to be welcoming. That's true. But mostly it's because, the employers who make the country wealthy want cheap labor. That's still an issue. And so this is not something that's, dead and gone away. It kind of still lives with us. Thank God the slavery part's gone. Thank God we'll get to well, I won't talk about Jim Crow in this course. You'll get to that in the next half of the survey. But it's not as if these things are of enduring, importance right now. That is it for this week in terms of the overview of chapter 12 and the readings for this week. I'll try and put up a second video this week. I'll go over some of the things, try to respond if I can to some of you guys' needs you mentioned in the feedback form, but also go over the final essay. I know I promised that last time. It's been busy, taxes, other sorts of things going on, but I should have that up by the end of the week. And so I'll give you guys some prep work for that. It's only about 3 or 4 weeks left. So you guys are going to should have an extra week this time. You won't be doing things the same week like you did with the midterm essay. So look for that. And hope you guys have a great week. Please keep up with the work, and we'll see you next time.